Thank you everyone for being here today. It's nice to see mental health professionals from different areas. Helps us retain perspective and hear about different local trends, if you will. So hopefully you'll learn something today that you can take back to your practice. Now, I'm gearing this primarily to people of retirement age. However, we know this subject is not unique to older people. Things can happen to younger folk as well. And the reason I am so passionate about this subject is personal. I was raised in a family that was a normal middle-class family in Upper Wisconsin. And it's seemingly overnight, my life changed. My father went into surgery on his back for back pain. He walked in, came out in a wheelchair. Now, mind you, this is in the 50s. Times have changed, techniques have changed and so forth. This might not have happened today, but we can't go backwards. But it did change my life. Losing use of your legs prevents you from driving, walking, many things. He was no longer the breadwinner. My mother became the breadwinner. I was helpful in caregiving as well as my mother. And he had to reinvent himself. He was 43 years old. I was 7, and we no longer had a family car until I began to drive. So I watched the evolution of my father as he went through this transition. And there were moments that were difficult for both my mother and father, of course. But in the end, and before he passed, he came to terms with it and reinvented himself. And that's a little bit about what we're going to speak of today. This process of transition that's forced upon us many times. Change happens, ready or not, change happens, life happens. Next slide, please. I love this saying because it captures it pretty well, and that is that the one constant in life is that it changes. And we all undergo change repeatedly throughout our lives, but some changes are harder than others because they're life-changing. And the people I'm speaking of are those that are left with a disability or need for care, or in some way reshaping their identity, if you will. Life won't be the same again for these folks. And they go through a period of feeling helpless, hopeless, maybe miserable, trying to come to terms with this. Maybe a new diagnosis, it may be a trauma, a disability that develops. At any rate, they're left with something new, something that no one prepares you for in life. Yes, think about time as unidirectional. Wouldn't it be nice if we could go back and redo parts of our life? We can't do that. Client may wish for a better past, but that's not going to help them in the present. Next slide, please. I've watched people struggle with the realization that this condition is not something that can be turned around. It's permanent. It's changing their life and everything they held dear in terms of their goals, their values, their responsibilities. There's a lot of unknowns. Well, as it is for all of us every day, but even more so with the new territory these folks are on. Many of the changes for these folks, and I'm speaking my father in general, is in their life quality because their level of independent functioning has really changed. They may be dependent now on either equipment, individuals, or changes in their environment so they can even move about. They may have changes in their functioning, such as speech, vision, maybe a head injury that caused a level of paralysis or loss of use of a limb, as in my father's case, both legs down from the waist, and just their general independence. And now having to rely on either a caregiver or a team, a care team, if you will, to help them function at a certain level. All right, next slide, please. Let me just say that, yes, this is not just an inconvenience, but a life change, but it's not just for the client. It's also for the person taking care of the client, and that may be a spouse, it may be a child, it may be a care team or some other member of the family. Now, I really have gotten a little bit into Buddhism, not that I embrace it or endorse it, but some of their thoughts are very logical to me now, that we're going to suffer, we're going to have things that change. As long as we believe that life is permanent, the way things are, the place we're comfortable, we believe they don't disintegrate or change, they can be counted on to make us feel secure and happy. And don't we go into retirement with that? We kind of have that mindset. Well, that may not be the world as it really is, but it's the illusion we'd like to live in sometimes. And while it lasts, it's wonderful. It is wonderful. So getting a new diagnosis or having a traumatic, abrupt change to your functioning often brings up all kinds of emotions. I remember my father saying, "Why did this happen to me? I've always been a hardworking man. I have done the right thing. You know, why me?" My brother, who developed a brain tumor, he was 43 also, lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. "Why did this happen to me? I followed a good path. I was a very smart guy. Why me? I have a family." Well, I guess that doesn't get a person anywhere, but we do engage in that. We do feel bad for ourselves. Some people may even feel guilty. Guilty if in fact there was some act they did, a behavior, error in judgment, something that may have caused an accident, maybe a motor vehicle accident, that maybe caused the problem that contributed to the new disability. So there may be a wide range of emotions initially. All right, next slide, please. I think most of our clients going through this will run a range of emotions that fluctuate throughout the day, especially early in their disability. Anger, frustration, resentment. They now see themselves differently. They may have really held pride in the fact that they could help other people or they could do certain things. And that whole image of themselves has changed. What they're going to know too is that people are going to react to them differently. Wow, that's hard when you used to think of yourself as self-sufficient, capable. Now people see you as disabled. It's not quite what you want to elicit from other people. However, it's a normal experience. And depending on the injury or the degree of disability, the client may have mind-body changes, which can result in changes in their energy level, what they can put forth. But think about it, if you're feeling and manifesting many of these emotional states, either openly or withholding them, it's going to change your energy level. And this too may be very frustrating to them. As I mentioned, those of us who dream of a retirement and what we're going to do during retirement, wow, this is all changed. We have to write a new plan. What are we going to do now? This is big. You build a lot of resources, values, surroundings, if you will, on this dream of retirement. You may have moved down here from your other home. At any rate, person who was once very caring and, if you will, independent with your self-care, now depends on others to do even the simplest things at times, whether it's bathing, toileting, ambulating. It's definitely changed how they see themselves as being independent and capable. They may need a whole care team, at least initially, or maybe forever, depending on the care that they're able to, get from their families. All right, next slide, please. Know that adaptation, getting accustomed to and transitioning through this period of adaptation is a process. And I was shocked when I found out actually how long this process on the average takes. They're telling me on the average of 5 years. Whoa. In that time, there's a lot of trial and error and new information and things to kind of sort through as you find your way with this new reality. I also heard that most of us go through anywhere from 3 to 5 major transitions in our life. Whoa. Now, that doesn't mean they're all of this level where you're disabled, but it could be significant life changes that we had not planned on. So this being the most severe, of course, in terms of having to deal with this issue. Now, what I found and what others have stated is that having a personality that tends more towards optimism, maybe more resilient, treatment outcomes are generally better. They believe in what they're doing, they know they can, they look forward in a positive attitude, and that's helpful. Those that are anxious, maybe pessimistic, guilt-ridden, if you will, may have a harder time. Those folks that have a history of any kind of mental illness, we need to identify. We need to identify at the time, because going through this will have an effect on what we have dealt with, what we've buried, what we've endured, what we think we've emerged from. I'm talking about anything from trauma to other medical disorders, psychiatric disorders, depression, anxiety, and what have you. Those need to be dealt with a little bit differently, more rigorously, if you will, and may require additional outside help, if you will. Definitely, if someone has a history of suicidality, that needs to be looked at, because it's very easy for people to slip in and out of hope, if you will, during this time. It can be very frustrating, very depressing, very difficult. So these changes typically result in changes not just for the client, but the family. I think of my own family and how, as I mentioned, my mother became the breadwinner. She did most of the manual grunt work around the house, or we had to hire it done. Father, who used to be able to get himself to a doctor appointment, get a haircut, whatever, now had to have people come to the house. Thank goodness in those days they still did that. So there's a big change in terms of how people function in the family. They may have more duties, more responsibilities, may change their goals. Maybe the wife wanted to go to school. Now she needs to be home and take care of the husband. Just an example. So with that can come some frustration, because other people may feel that their life story has been changed as well, and indeed it has. Again, to reiterate, these serious chronic illnesses or disabilities. Now, by serious chronic illness, it could be anything from something we know it's going to progress, MS, Parkinson's, things like that, that'll ultimately maybe rob you of your mobility. As I mentioned, the client's going to experience a real spectrum of emotion. Now, this doesn't happen just in the hospital at the time that perhaps the diagnosis is made. This happens ongoing, and it can be prolonged. It can be significant in the fact that they may need additional help. Now, years ago, people stayed in the hospital longer. Nowadays, they are releasing them earlier. Some hospitals do, in fact, have care. They have rehab, where physical rehab, which helps the patient attain some level of mobility or self-reliance or independence. However, that too has been shortened, whether by insurance or what have you. So, and they used to give therapy in the hospitals. I know some may still do that for those people coming out of situations like this. But this is definitely a place where we can tag on to the hospital care and be a part of the patient's treatment, especially after things like this that are life-changing. Even a stroke, people, can rob you of functioning. So I don't want to make this sound like it has to be an accident, or, these can be everyday events for people that cause these issues. And the patient goes through all of these stages that we, I think, as therapists can recognize as grief, things that people go through during grief: the denial, the bargaining, anger, depression, and ultimately acceptance. However, I'm a firm believer that healing from grief is no longer a linear process. It's not. People are in and out of these periods during healing for quite some time. As I mentioned, that stage of transition can be up to 5 years. So I don't know if we've outgrown the old grief system as we used to conceive it. Many still hold on to that denial with the belief that maybe, just maybe, they got that diagnosis wrong. Or maybe there's some miracle cure out there that I don't know about, but I'm going to keep looking, that'll help me. get back to my normal functioning. So between that denial and bargaining, you know, and realization that it's not happening, you're going to have frustration, you're going to have outbursts, you're going to have depression. Sometimes the anger's turned inward if they're blaming themselves. Sometimes it's projected out towards those who are caring for them. Could be the doctor, could be the spouse, could be the children. They could all be recipients of what the client is going through. And it's not to blame the client. It's just to know what can be expected given the thinking and mindset that the client holds about his or her state of being. And again, as I mentioned, suicidal intent really needs to be identified, dealt with, maybe inpatient treatment, maybe they need medication or more intensive therapy. If indeed the client has become abusive, and I mean abusive in terms of harming other people, that needs to be identified and dealt with therapeutically as well. That is not okay. There are other ways to deal with the frustration and anger they feel. All right, next page, please. So especially in the beginning, I think some close monitoring is absolutely essential. So what are some of the long-term therapeutic goals with these clients? I mean, indeed, we want them to heal or become whole again. That's our ultimate goal. But know that the goal is acceptance. And people are going to vary in terms of how long they take to reach that point. It's not helpful for us to say to that person, oh, be strong, you can do this. That's a platitude, that's not helpful. We need to have compassion. And sometimes, unless we've lived it or been close to it or dealt with others that have it, that might be difficult, at least to express that. The other thing is, I think a lot of, say, physicians and what have you, we're reaching a stage of burnout. And when you're burned out, it's harder, a little harder to be empathic. But I think that's absolutely one of the things in the beginning, especially, and as time goes on, of course, but to show the client that we feel for what they're going through. If you say to them, I know how you feel, no, that's not helpful either, because we don't know what they feel. We've not been there. Okay, very important as the client moves toward healing that they mourn their losses, what they can no longer do. If they're going to rewrite their narrative, develop a new identity, life path, they need to mourn their losses. This might be skills they used to have. It could be how they saw themselves in terms of social functioning, vocational functioning, being a husband, being a wife. That means as therapists, we really need to look at what their existing values are, what's important to them. What about how they see themselves? Self-concept. Those will need to change. Skill sets. My father used to work at a lumber company. Couldn't do that anymore, I can tell you that. He needed to learn new skills. There are places to do that. There are facilities, there are companies that can assist with that. Now, as social workers, psychologists, we can be helpful in bridging that gap if it's not being done already. I remember for my father, Easter seals was huge, and they came to the house. They taught him woodworking. My father had worked at a greenhouse part-time. They helped him to build a business of arranging flowers, making wreaths. I mean, it was wonderful. So they spent time with him. The way they spent time, the client prior to the injury, what were their hobbies? What did they enjoy? That may all need to change. My father loved to boat and fish. That's a little hard when you're a paraplegic. He developed new hobbies. He became a stamp collector, a coin collector. So shifting their narrative from why to going forward, what's next? How can we build on what we can do? And that may take a lot of examination on the part of the client, with your help, to examine what's still important to them. What can they live with? What can't they live with? And moving forward. Now, some of this may require changes even in their living space. I know once my father was in a wheelchair, he could no longer fit through the doors. We had to have the doors widened. If he wanted to go outdoors, we had to have a ramp built in the house for him to get down from the steps that we had in the house. Little things like that. That sounds small, but they're huge because they can open up new worlds to the folks. Even the fact of sliding in and out of bed. How do you do that when you're a paraplegic? Well, they have better tools nowadays, better supports. I remember him sliding from the wheelchair on a board into the bed with a trapeze, if you will. His arms were strong. So adaptations can be made, and there are people that help with that. It's finding those that can do that for them. Building a new life plan. The other thing I think is absolutely critical, and my father had others come to him that had been through similar situations. Of course, not identical, but similar, to inspire him, to support him, to encourage him. Yes, you may take a life path with this new project or this new career interest or whatever that really isn't a good fit, and that's okay. That's okay. There are no mistakes, only information, which means you make a change. Try something just a little bit different. Well, think about yourselves. I think about myself in terms of my life course. When I realized I didn't want to be a hairdresser forever, for various reasons, I, changed my life path. It's okay. And the more comfortable you become with change, the easier it is to make those changes. Finally, on this page, important to help the client deal with others and their reactions to the disability and labeling, if you will, the client now as handicapped. There is a bit of a social stigma toward being handicapped because they view people as being less able. That whole idea is called ableism. I guess you could compare it to being a different color. People only see the color of your skin and not what you are and who you are. Same thing with a disability. You want them to see who you are. I think of the Cyndi Lauper commercial for psoriasis, and she says, "See me." I think that's absolutely critical. We get people to see the person we are and not the outside frame, if you will, of our being. I think it's important to teach the client some comebacks when people ask kind of insensitive questions, if you will. I remember seeing somebody on the streets of San Francisco, and he was in a wheelchair, and I saw somebody go up to him and say to him, "What's wrong with you?" Not the most sensitive question. And the guy, who had been pretty quiet, said to him, "Nothing, what's wrong with you?" All right, a little comeback. Another time, and I thought this one was good too, give them a sense of humor, your clients. Somebody said to him, "How did you end up in a wheelchair?" Because it was a young person. And the person in the wheelchair said, "I asked this guy what he was doing in a wheelchair." Okay. Well, I guess rather than going through your whole life story with everybody that asks, probably better for the client to have a flip answer for those that are a little bit insensitive. And again, you want them to see you as a person and not a handicapped person. Before we flip the page, I want to also just mention that in this whole process, we cannot forget the caregivers. And I say caregivers because I prefer that over caretakers. Caregivers have needs too, just like the disabled person does. There are basically 4 parts of us: heart and soul, mind, body. And they all interact. And my feeling is we should nourish each of those every day, whether you're a caregiver or the client with the disability. So encouraging self-care during this time, things that renew you, things that give you life and energy, things that make you see the bigger picture. It may be that you have to go out into the bigger sphere. Some view the garden outside as part of our being too. That being our social life, our social interactions, our social relationships. Find out what's important to the client, that which renews him or her. And know that self-care, whether you're a caregiver or the client, is not selfish. It's not selfish. It's absolutely essential if you're taking care of somebody else. And I stress this all the time in my groups I run. You can't help someone else if your own energy level is in the tank. But we need to know ourselves and know what we need. If, in fact, the caregiver becomes stressed out, depressed, burned out, we see medical mistakes happen. And we know that the client may not have as good an outcome if, in fact, the caregiver isn't taking care of his or herself. Medical mistakes such as, I don't know, medication management, Maybe they forget to give them the medication, or they give them the wrong amount, or the wrong time, or in the wrong combination. So very important that caregivers take care of themselves, sorry. Caregivers probably should accompany their loved one to the doctor appointments. I think it behooves both the client and the caregiver to find out as much as you can about the client's condition, diagnoses, or issue, because you can then ask questions. You can then ask about various treatments that may be helpful. I think it's also important, and I hear this more and more, and I don't mean to be sexist here, but sometimes men tend to minimize symptoms when they go to the doctor, okay? Having the wife along sometimes can keep it real, can share what she or he has witnessed or heard. And I think it's important to keep that accurate, the reporting, because the doctor can't treat that which he or she doesn't know about or isn't presented in an appointment. Caregivers need to have self-compassion and know that all of us, though we don't want to admit it, have a breaking point. And yours might be different than mine and vice versa. We need to know what sustains us and how we can keep functioning at a high level. Okay, next page. All right, accepting the disability. That is a big therapeutic goal, and it may be lengthy. Now, I don't know if most of us engage in short-term therapy, but this is not a short-term issue. Now, it may be that you see a patient for a protracted time, take a break, let them try some things, come back, reassess, try something new. It may be that it has to be ongoing, but spaced in order to satisfy both insurance requirements and also allow the patient some space and time to try different things. Keep in mind, just like as in alcoholism, until that client accepts that they have a disability, that is, they give up the denial, they give up the hopefulness for a miracle cure, what have you. Until they accept that, they probably will never take control and move forward. Disability doesn't define who they are. It just puts them on a different path. They absolutely, yes, have to mourn the loss of what they had, what they did, what they can no longer do. But it clears the path for finding new ways of doing things and doing new things. Maybe that which you didn't have time to do before, now you do. For some people, that's scary. Some people aren't as adventuresome as others in terms of trying new things, trusting that they'll be okay if they fail at something, or they don't do well at it, or they don't like it, or it didn't suit them. But that's okay. That, as I mentioned, that's just information. That is feedback, and it puts you on a different path. It's okay. Let the client be helpful in decision making, but help them know when they are stuck. when they need to clear some of the thinking that might be holding them back. I like this one. This period of transition where you move from moving through the grief and you're in the acceptance phase. I told you it takes about 5 years. Somebody mentioned that the length of time is longer than you think, but not longer than you need. So keep that in mind. It should be flexible. Everyone's going to be different in terms of how long that takes. And a lot may be personality that can either obstruct or facilitate that change. I like the way some people term these stages, if you will. With the first stage being the long goodbye. That's when you're mourning the losses. And again, it's the identity. It's part of the identity of who you were, what you did, that you're letting go of. Then there comes the messy middle. I love these terms. The messy middle is the time when they're exploring, trying new things, maybe pulling back, trying something else. That could go on a while. But finally, the last stage being the new beginning, the new life path, the new narrative. All right, next page, please. I think we talked a little bit about ableism and attitudes of others toward those with disabilities. But the thing that struck me was the degree of victimization that occurs in the disabled population versus the non-disabled. You hear sometimes even this happens in care facilities, which is a little scary. So having an eye and ear open for anything like that that could be going on, whether you see a bruise or they mention something like that to you, I think is extremely important. The last thing we want our clients to feel is like a victim. We're trying to get them to feel empowered. Now, I've seen people that I didn't even know were disabled. They may have had a brain injury or some other disability that just wasn't apparent to the human eye until you got to start talking with them or interacted with them. So people can be vulnerable and you may not know that. So important to kind of probe and feel out the level of disability in your clients. Now, there are some that are still, you know, they may acquire a disability, but they were still working, even in the villages. These folks may be special in terms of needing a cognitive psychological assessment to show that they may have a disorder that's secondary to their physical disability. Psychologists and others that perform those can be helpful in that process. Sometimes they can apply for special compensation, whether Social Security or what have you. We can all be helpful in that, either in terms of encouraging them or even starting the process for them. But please, as a therapist, even though they're in the moment, encourage them to think about the future in terms of other medical decisions they may have to make with any rehospitalization, anything about their finances, their property. It may be a living will. At some point, they need to be thinking about that, especially if they're in a more precarious, unknown medical state. That day to day, you may not know what could happen. All right, next slide, please. Yeah, keep in mind that our lives are like stories that keep getting interrupted regularly. And this actually gives us a sense of agency and purpose, that life happens in the transitions. I think all of us can relate to something that may have happened to us that we didn't plan for, was totally unexpected, may have really rocked our world and changed things for us. Didn't have to be as traumatic as a disability, but it could be anything else, loss of a job, what have you. Life happens in the transitions. Why? Because it forces us to get in touch with our values, what's important in our life, what's our purpose, and make changes and develop skills that we didn't know we had. Now, some of the things, and we're talking about the big five here that you're going to see. And I mentioned some of this to you, but I'm going to go over them again. I think fear is obvious because it's inborn. Response to the unknown. Some believe that it has its basis in fear of death, which is a primitive kind of thing. But it's a reaction against what could happen, whether that be a struggle, whether that be a lifetime of being lonely, cut off from others, forever changed, or death. And of course, we need to confront our fears head on, because some of those long-held ideals and ways of experiencing the world no longer fit or serve us. Finding ways to deal with fear. And we all have tools we use, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or what have you. We have tools we can help them with that. Worry is another one, especially perpetual worry. And we know that our inner dialogue can certainly keep that going, the what ifs. And certainly with all the unknowns, they do emerge. I love what Lou, one of our co-workers, used to do. I think she had a worry chart. What can I control? What can't I control? You know, making a chart anyway that shows some things that are out of our control we need to let go of. There are some things that should be prioritized, that should be a higher level, and yeah, problem solve. Don't worry, problem solve. And others we just need to let go of. Other techniques are, maybe you've all heard of these, like the worry chair, sitting in the worry chair, that chair over there, 10 minutes, after 10 minutes, done. But I'm not a believer in worry, that does any good. I firmly believe in making a plan. And you make a plan on those you can control and those within our ability to carry out. We all know that things like calming your mind, focused breathing, mindfulness, meditation, all these things help. Self-talk can bring people down in a spiral real fast, real fast. How about stress? Yeah, day-to-day stress, boy. The tyranny of the shoulds. I should be able to do this for myself. I should, at my age, be able to do this. You know, whatever we tell ourselves, or whatever the patient tells himself, I should say, that kind of perpetuates this self-derogation and, you know, breaking down self-esteem. Those expectations and values the client had maybe need to change. What's acceptable? What's not? What's doable? What's not? But letting go of the shoulds. None of us should on ourselves. And depression, of course, can set in when we can't manage any of the above. And we can't find any level of fulfillment, peace, whatever in our new world. That's tough. That's tough. For some, the path to depression is shorter because of past history. For some, the unknown still is difficult, but the path forward is uncharted. We don't know. We can't see the end. We can only see where we're going and stay on that path. We don't know what lies ahead. None of us do, for that matter. It's a tough one to let go of. I'd like to think that we allow our clients to become, if you will, courageous explorers. With our encouragement, with our helping them to make the path, goal set, evaluate, and move forward. Know that learning something new is the best antidote for grief. Because grief is really living in the past, is it not? Not wanting to let go of what was. Curiosity is really incompatible with grief. Think about that. And remember that life is in the transitions, and none of us are granted security, peace, love, health for the rest of our lives. That just isn't what's in it for us. All right, next slide, please. Now, here's a lady who's really pretty stuck, I would say, really feeling badly, maybe not knowing where to go, what to do, what's next. Life is about living. It's not just being alive. Life is about living. And we as therapists can be helpful in creating new pathways for our clients to do this. Remember, the long goodbye, the messy middle, the new beginning. Those are the stages. Freeing ourselves from expectations. All right, next slide, please. And this is my daddy. I'd say this is probably about 1964. And as you can see, he's outside, very proud of his begonia bed that he planted and nurtured. My dad went on to do woodworking. He made furniture for children, and such as cradles for dolls, little cupboards for little girls. He made bookcases and toy chests, wall hangings, wreaths, you name it. So there are ways to reinvent yourself, if you will. Never easy, but faced with the, I guess, alternative, it gives you a chance to find some purpose, meaning, and a new identity, if you will. And the blessing I felt from him being in the chair and home is that he was home more. We had good discussions, long, deep discussions. And he had this thing about time, sweet time. So enjoy the time we have and get your clients to do the same. Life is about living, not just being alive. Thank you. Thank you.